wide canvas, so I hope I can cover all of it. But whatever I can cover in the more formal presentation, perhaps what we can do is later take up in the question and answer session, whatever gets left over. So let me begin by offering an overview of the international environment today, as this obviously impacts and has a bearing, a very close bearing on the working and the dynamics at the United Nations. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I've only just got here, so I didn't have the time to prepare one, but the next time I can do that. I think most of you will agree that this is an unsettled time in global affairs. We are in fact in the midst of a phase of unprecedented, is one of the ways that we can. So let me identify 8 features of the current global landscape which I think are noteworthy. First, something that Azaz also referred to, the challenges to an erosion of a rules-based international order, which is reflected in a number of developments. The renunciation of agreements that were previously arrived at, the rejection of treaties, again, previously arrived at, and the tendency by major powers to act unilaterally in defiance of established rules. This is happening in regions, and this is happening globally as well, including in the trade wars that have been imposed. There are many other examples too. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, case in point, the rejection of the Iranian nuclear deal by a major power, the renunciation of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and even withdrawal from multilateral bodies like the Human Rights Council. These are all challenges to a rules-based international order. Second characteristic is the renewal of East-West tensions and the resurgence of competition between the major powers, which has been described by some as the advent of a new Cold War. This, of course, has also seen much closer collaboration between China and Russia, and we've seen examples of that only recently in the news headlines. Third, we see a weakening of the European project, which has been accelerated by Brexit, and this raises questions about the EU's future diplomatic weight. A great shame, because the EU has been such an ardent advocate and a supporter of multilateralism. Fourth feature, I would say, is the emergence of anti-globalization forces in the West and the resort to protectionist policies that could further undermine and reverse aspects of globalization. I think all of globalization is hard to reverse, but certainly many aspects of globalization are in the process of some kind of reversal. The fifth important characteristic, I think, of the international environment is, of course, the continued turmoil in the Middle East and the intensification of tensions amongst the major regional powers there. I don't need to spell this out. It's pretty obvious who I mean. And the sixth characteristic is that in a fluid global environment, there are efforts by the major powers to rewrite the rules of the game in their own regions through a series of unilateral actions. Again, I don't need to illustrate. In our own region, we've seen a unilateral action by our neighbor to the east. So this is something that is, part of a global trend as well. The seventh, again, self-evident, Asia as the principal driver of global economic growth and the global economy. The eighth feature, I would say, is intensifying competition between major powers and others also in the area of advanced technologies. And in fact, this has become the new arena for competition between the big powers. The military uses of new technologies, for example, killer robots, autonomous weapon systems, these pose new challenges because there's nothing to regulate them. There's nothing to regulate their use. But at the same time, while new technologies are also creating new opportunities for economic and social progress. So it's a question of how, technology is used in the future and how we are able to regulate them, if at all. And if I could add the last sort of ninth feature, it would be that in a global environment, which is in constant flux at the moment, what we see are networks or ad hoc coalitions becoming the preferred alignment of choice by countries. So in other words, formal alliances of the past are giving way to these ad hoc coalitions. Often there are single issue coalitions that come together on a certain issue and then they dissipate when that issue has been resolved. Now this of course is not an exhaustive list, but it does indicate how multilateralism is being challenged. So let me now turn to some of this and the way that it is affecting the state of play at the United Nations. As I'm trying to follow quite faithfully the way that you structured your thoughts and asked me, and we had no prior agreement amongst us. I think the most obvious illustration of these dynamics is to be found in the working of the Security Council, in its actions and more often in its inactions, its inability to act. It is more frequently deadlocked, it is regularly paralyzed, and when proceedings do take place, they often assume a very acrimonious tone. And often no agreement really emerges from there. And as you know, this is the premier body charged with the maintenance of international peace and security. So conflicts and disputes that need to be addressed are often left to fester or put in a state of continuous but inconclusive negotiation, as for example the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli peace process, or the negotiations with Syria, Yemen, or even tensions on the Korean Peninsula, which has been so high on the Security Council agenda and high on the global agenda as well. And compounding this state of affairs are, of course, what I referred to earlier, unilateral actions by global and regional powers in explicit violation of Security Council resolutions, and this further retards or hobbles any effort at peaceful settlement of these issues or these disputes. I think what we also see in the Security Council is counterterrorism issues becoming increasingly politicized. We see rising number of technical holds, and I will go into this later if you wish me to, because this is a very technical area. But under the UN sanctions regime, counterterrorism sanctions regime, countries are putting more frequently technical holds, and they're more frequently sort of rejecting the listing of certain terrorist entities or individuals because it is geopolitics that is influencing this whole area. Then, of course, other examples include the work of the First Committee, which, as you probably know, deals with disarmament issues. This has been in a state of, virtual deadlock, if I can describe it that way. And it's been unable really to make much progress because of the deep divisions and the disagreements in this. Not unlike what's happening in the Conference on Development, the CD in Geneva. But the First Committee also, very little work, although the proceedings continue every year, but very little in terms of any kind of concrete outcomes. Also, we see that in the first and second committees of the United Nations, of the General Assembly, which deal with development and human rights respectively, we see that in the past, issues used to be decided by consensus. But now there are an increasing number of votes that are called on these issues. And again, this shows the nature of division, which produces this kind of outcome. Then we see polarization and intense agreement even on humanitarian issues. For example, the Global Compact on Refugees, which was adopted last year. It was agreed upon in 2015, very important global compact, which basically, obliges countries to follow certain rules, but it's not a treaty, it's not a formal treaty. It's just a set of principles that countries are supposed to adhere to. And this happened in the backdrop of all the refugees and the forced migration that was taking place in Europe. There were very, very chilling examples of people sinking in yachts. So, this was the backdrop against which some of this happened. And we had almost every country out of the 193 member states of the UN agreeing to the Global Compact, except for the United States. So they agreed to it, but when the time came for adoption, there were only 164 countries that signed up to it, or they adopted it rather, they had signed up to it earlier. Now this again shows how domestic politics in many of these European countries trumped their commitment to a multilateral arrangement, because it was, as I said, not a formal treaty or an agreement. So you can see that, much of the work of the UN is being affected by the headwinds of these global, these characteristics of the global environment. And it's a fraught global environment. With that, let me turn to Pakistan and its engagement at the United Nations. And this, as Azaz also mentioned, our engagement at the UN began very early, in fact, only a month after our independence. And as our independence preceded the independence of many countries, in fact, most countries in Africa, and some countries in Asia, we were able to play a key role in the decolonization process, which gave us early, if you like, an early strong voice, as well as, I would say, respect within the Committee of Nations at the United Nations. And over the years, Pakistan has been a very ardent advocate of multilateralism. And of course, we've always emphasized the primacy of the UN in international affairs. Now, our engagement at the UN is extended to all three pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, human rights, and development. Our engagement in the UN has involved both hard and soft power, what I like to call hard and soft power. Because in the realm of ideas, which is the realm of soft power, we've seen that personalities such as Dr. Mehboob ul-Haq, contributed so much, which had so much far-reaching impact in the area of human development. The notion of the Human Development Index, for example, he had a major role to play in the evolution of that paradigm. Then we also had a Pakistani woman, Nafis Sadiq, who was the architect behind UNFPA, the UN's family planning agency. And another distinguished woman headed UNSCAP only a few years ago. She stepped down, I think, 2 years ago. So you've seen that even in the realm of ideas, Pakistan has played a key role. In norm building at the UN, Pakistan again has played a role in contributing the ideas that have shaped many of the processes at the UN. Now, in terms of hard power, obviously this is more visible because it's hard power. Pakistan has for decades been amongst the world's top and most consistent contributor to UN peacekeeping. Our participation in US peacekeeping, spanning over 6 decades, I think is a tangible manifestation of the country's commitment to the maintenance of international peace and security. Since 1960, Pakistan has sent 200,000 troops, which have served in 46 missions and 28 countries around the world. Today, as I speak, we have over 5,000 troops serving in 9 missions, mostly in Africa, under the UN's flag. 156 of our soldiers have paid the ultimate price for upholding peace and have embraced shahadat or martyrdom in the line of duty. As you know, we are also host to one of the oldest UN missions in our country, which is UNMOGIP, or the UN Military Observer Group for India and Pakistan. And the role of UNMOGIP has become even more significant in the wake of August 5th, when India illegally annexed, occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So this is an important UN force that we've always supported, and we have been able to thwart a number of sinister efforts at the UN to cut UNMOGIP's budget over the last few years, which could have in the future led to its disbandment. So this is something that, successive PRs at the UN have been preoccupied with. I'm sure Azaz would remember from his own time there. Now, we've also been a leading voice in policy evolution and norm building in the area of peacekeeping. And one of the recent initiatives that we took there, I led that initiative, was to set up an informal group of top troop and police contributing countries, which we undertook as a joint venture with Morocco. And this has played a key role in discussing some of the issues which are important as peacekeeping begins to change, to reflect a very changed environment. And this has been acknowledged by the Secretary General himself. He's often appreciated the role of the group that we set up. Now, Pakistan's engagement and standing in the UN is also reflected in other ways. It's reflected in the frequent election that Pakistan has won to key UN bodies. For example, we have served 7 times in the Security Council. This is not a modest achievement. This is a significant achievement because the election, as Azaz would remember, is a very hard-fought one for membership of the Security Council. So every time we've contested, we have won. And 7 times, as I said, which means every decade of our independent existence, we have served in the world's most important multilateral body. We've also been elected 4 times to the Human Rights Council. And in recent years, we've been elected to be a member of the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, and recently we were also elected as one of its vice presidents. In fact, this was the 2nd time in 4 years that we were elected as a vice president. We're also members of several other UN bodies. I don't want to list all of them, but I think this is a measure of the standing that Pakistan enjoys in the international community, because you don't just get elected unless the international community has confidence and faith in you and in your role and in your activism. Nobody likes members of these bodies to be dead ones. They want them to be very active, and Pakistan has remained very active. We've also, of course, played a very key role in the area of economic and social development at the UN. We played a key role in the follow-up to the comprehensive implementation of the outcomes of 3 major UN conferences, which included the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. So these were the more recent processes at the UN, and we played a key role. When the UN Secretary General, the present one, announced a series of reforms of the UN in the area of peace and security management, as well as development, again, we were very active in shaping the discourse which led to the conclusion of these reforms. And it was a role for which the Secretary General was always he spoke very highly of our role. Now, as you might know, at the UN we negotiate as part of negotiating groups. Countries cannot negotiate individually. You can on issues which are just of your concern, but more broadly, we are members of NAM, the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIC, and of course we are a member of the Group of 77 in China. So as part of these groups, in these groups, Pakistan does shape the positions of these groups, or at least takes an active part in shaping the position of these groups, especially the Group of 77 and China on economic issues, to ensure that whatever emerges from this is in sync with our national economic priorities. Now, turning to what I know much of the question answer will be on the issue of occupied Kashmir. So let me now turn to our priorities at the UN, because obviously our priorities at the UN reflect and echo our national priorities and our core foreign policy goals, even as we engage across the spectrum on a range of global issues. But we are there to push our own goals and interests as well. And as Kashmir is Pakistan's core foreign policy priority, it of course remains front and center of our efforts and an engagement at the UN. It is, as you know, one of the oldest items on the UN Security Council agenda, along with Palestine. The agenda item is actually called the India-Pakistan question. And we refer to this agenda item whenever we address letters to the Council that we ask for circulation, so that the Council is fully abreast of what is happening in our region. And of course, it is under this agenda item that we continue to call for a peaceful resolution of the dispute in accordance with Security Council resolutions, which we always argue is crucial for the maintenance of regional and global peace and security. In fact, in the wake of India's illegal August 5th action, which, as you know, forcibly annexed Kashmir, it was under this agenda item that, with the help of China, we were able to ensure that the Security Council met to consult, to take up the issue of what was happening on the ground in occupied Jammu and Kashmir on August the 16th. This was the first time in 53 years that the Security Council explicitly took up the issue of occupied Jammu and Kashmir. We have since then and earlier too, kept the Council, the Secretary General, and the Secretariat briefed about the developments in occupied Kashmir, urging the need for action by all of them. We've also regularly raised the issue during meetings of the Security Council, the General Assembly, under different agenda items, and of course the various committees of the General Assembly. The third committee is particularly important because this is the Human Rights Committee. This is the committee that deals with human rights. And only recently, our annual resolution on the right of peoples to self-determination was adopted by the third committee. And this is a very firm and unanimous affirmation of a fundamental right by members of the international community. It was adopted by, I think, by the committee, we had over 80 co-sponsors for this, which shows the wide support that is enjoyed by this resolution. Now, of course, the lack of resolution of Kashmir, the non-implementation of not just one, but 11 specific resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir shapes public perceptions in our country about the role of the UN. This is obvious. It's inevitable. It shapes my perception, your perception, everyone's perception in our country. And questions are raised about the UN's utility. And as Ambassador Azaz said, it raises the question about whether the UN is able to play a role that has been assigned to it by all the countries of the world. And this disenchantment or disappointment with the UN at the public level in our country, at the government level too, is not unique to Pakistan. I think what we're witnessing across the world is a growing wave of skepticism about the UN and whether it is fit for purpose, especially fit for purpose in a world that has changed so dramatically since the Second World War, which is when the UN and all the other multilateral arrangements were set up. And there is increasing disillusionment with not just the UN, but other multilateral institutions as well. Now, as far as the UN is concerned, much of this public disillusionment is directed or focused on the peace and security pillar of the United Nations. And that means the Security Council, because that is the premier body that deals with peace and security. I think as far as the humanitarian and the development functions of the UN are concerned, one, much less is known about them at the public level. And two, I think if more was known about them, it would establish the fact that the UN does very well in those areas. It is the peace and security area that is the contentious and the one that produces so much disappointment. So, the Council is seen widely to have fallen short of its principal role. Its failure to resolve long-standing disputes and ongoing crises, and in the case of occupied Kashmir, to implement its own resolutions, are seen as examples of persistent failure by the United Nations, by the Security Council. And this brings up what Ambassador Azaz also wanted me to address, which is the issue of Security Council reform. Security Council reform, the process for Security Council reform, the negotiations for reform have been going on for the past 2.5 decades, with little agreement emerging on the fundamentals of such reform and with no solution in sight. The principal reason for this persisting impasse in negotiations is the gap in position between a handful of countries that seek permanent members for themselves and others, including Pakistan, led by Italy as coordinator of what is called the Uniting for Consensus group, which advocates elected members of the Council. So in other words, expansion of the Security Council by adding elected members and not by adding more permanent members, as is advocated by the G4. But before I come to the G4, one of the reasons there is so much traction to the position taken by Italy, Pakistan, and other members of the UFC is that people recognize that the source of paralysis in the Security Council are the permanent members. It's not the elected members who are the source of paralysis. They're the ones who have the veto. It's not elected members or the non-permanent members who have the veto. And it is always the threat of the veto, often not exercised, but the threat of the veto, that then paralyzes the Council and stymies any progress on any issue, whatever the issue may be at hand. So the G4, which is of course India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, have been spearheading the move for expansion of the Council by adding more permanent members essentially for themselves, while Pakistan, as I said, has been advocating the addition to the Council of non-permanent seats. We remain firmly opposed to the addition of permanent members, as this, we argue, would be contrary to the democratic principle that defines our age. We have a long-standing position which is based on two fundamental principles. The first is that we want a council that is more representative of all member states, small, medium, large, and not one where privilege is the preserve of just a few. We do not believe in expanding the club of the privileged. Two, we feel that any reform effort should be consistent, as I said before, with the democratic spirit of our time. Thus, more elected members will make the council more representative and inclusive, and also accountable to the larger membership, because accountability is only established by regular elections and rotation of members of the council. Now, of course, to make the council, to ensure that any reform succeeds of the Security Council, the position of permanent members is very important, the existing permanent members, for any kind of reform. Any increase in the Security Council membership will require an amendment to the UN Charter. And that's like an amendment to our national constitution. It is as serious and sober a process. Countries don't amend their constitutions easily. And this is a constitution that determines, that member states, 193 member states, have accepted as a constitution that governs them, along with the principles of the Charter. So amending the Charter is no easy business. It will require a resolution to be adopted with a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. And then, in a given time frame, the Charter amendment based on this resolution would have to be ratified by at least 2/3 of UN member states, including the 5 permanent members. So you can see it is, even if agreement is reached, and as I said, it's nowhere in sight, the process leading to actual conclusion of such a reform is going to be a very long and laborious one, in which the P5 would have to agree to whatever changes are going to be happening. So however challenging and difficult at a time when the international system is under so much stress, an important way, I think, to strengthen multilateralism would be to strengthen, of course, the role of the United Nations. And this objective, to my mind, can best be achieved by a comprehensive reform of the Security Council, however tough. This is the core. This is the quintessential core of the United Nations. And without reform of the Security Council, you're not going to be able to change much. And thus, you're not going to be able to change public perceptions, which, as I said, are marked by doubts and skepticism about the UN's role. So let me try to wind up where I started, which is the threats and the stress that multilateralism is under. But the need also, I want to say, in an uncertain and fractured world, to renew our own and public faith in the utility of multilateralism, because multilateralism has delivered in so many ways. But I will perhaps come to that in the question and answer session. We are, as I said at the very start, passing through a phase in international affairs where challenges abound. We are witnessing new forms of authoritarianism in many parts of the world, in our own region as well. And we see extreme intolerance taking hold again in our neighborhood. You can see that, graphic examples of that, chilling examples of that. Xenophobia is on the rise, Islamophobia is on the rise. And of course, what we are also seeing is a record number of people who've been displaced in the world, either because of poverty or conflict or persecution. Now, these are global problems. They're global challenges. We're also witnessing wide-ranging impunity, including for violations of international law, international humanitarian law as well. So there is, for reasons that I mentioned earlier, also the risk of new arms races. And of course, all kinds of competition in cyberspace which could also, people refer to this as new forms of warfare, which of course they are. But all of this is out there and is making our world much more fraught. Now, in this fraught environment, multilateralism is needed more than ever. In its simplest sense, what does it mean? I mean, multilateralism in its simplest sense is about acknowledging that we need global responses to global issues and global challenges. A retreat from multilateralism means that countries will take actions on their own with little regard for established rules or established norms. And it will also mean that an exclusion will be practiced as a tool. And, we know that exclusion as a tool of governance doesn't work nationally anymore, that it can actually work in the long run internationally. So few of the challenges countries face in an interconnected world can be addressed by any country on its own, no matter how powerful that country may be. The nature of today's complex challenges cannot be met in isolation, separately from the rest of the world. And that urges the need to engage in positive sum games rather than act out of negative or zero-sum calculations. So given the need for international cooperation and solidarity to deal with the issues of our times, I feel, and I think Pakistan also feels, that multilateralism needs to be strengthened and defended, even if it has to be reformed and adapted. But we need global institutions, and we need the United Nations for all sorts of reasons. So let me close with a quote from the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. He'll be very happy that I quoted him, who said at the recent Paris Peace Forum, and I quote, "Multilateralism must not enter the future backwards. Without the multilateral system and respect for international rules, we risk a return solely to power relations, reward sanction mechanisms, and a cycle of frozen conflicts," unquote. So we shouldn't sit back to watch an assault on multilateralism just when it is needed most. But as I said before also, multilateralism may need to adapt to a changed world in order to restore and renew people's faith in the value and the utility of multilateralism. And multilateralism has to be predicated not just on governments. I think that era also has passed. It has to involve the participation of civil society, of non-governmental organizations that do such stellar work, of young people, because young people are the future, and actually falling confidence in the UN is most dramatically illustrated amongst younger people across the world. Again, this is not just Pakistan, across the world. Young people seem to want to know, they want to know very little about the UN because they think it doesn't really do anything very significant. That, of course, is not true, but we need to address that rather than say, sorry, you don't know enough. The private sector also has to be involved in this new multilateralism. So should academia, because ideas is what changed the world, and ideas are needed in a world that is beset by so many problems and challenges. With that, I will close. I hope I followed faithfully what was expected of me, but I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have a question and answer session which will be moderated by Director General ISSIM.
But the details come out only when we have the discussions. So the floor is open, but before I do that, let me just announce that this particular lecture was also telecast on the Facebook.
Win-win for everyone, as the Chinese like to call it, and I completely agree. Who is part of this enterprise, of this initiative, has agreed to play by rules that of multilateralism. It is enormous and it's uncharted territory, because if countries begin to defy previously agreed arrangements, then you are looking at a very turbulent
at least two major powers, they're making relations very turbulent. Obviously, the initiative to stability.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Mike.
And giving a very comprehensive, insightful talk on UN and multilateralism. As a multilateral structure rooted in the post-Second World War, more effectively in a bipolar world order. Now that we are moving towards a multipolar world order, one aspect, the second aspect which I would like your insightful comment on are essentially spearheaded by geoeconomics. So is focusing on redistribution of authority between states, interest in alternative arrangements. So in that context, do you expect geo
Right in saying that it's not just the peace and security pillar that needs to, in a way, adapt to a changed and changing world, but the other pillars. So you're looking at a host of institutions, not just the United Nations headquartered in New York. And naturally, I think to revive faith in multilateralism, it has to go the whole hog. But you've got to start somewhere as well. You're not going to see reform coming across the board. It will come, bit by bit, I think, because agreement, as General Durrani was also saying, agreement is very hard amongst 193 members. What an amazing experience it was. I had never done multilateralism before. It was an amazing experience from the point of view that it was a constant daily challenge to align your country's interests with the interests of others for the common good. Huge intellectual challenge as well. And I think that is so important because there is a common good. There are common goals. I mean, reducing poverty is a common goal. There can't be any politics in that, surely. And I think if we look at what multilateralism has already delivered, in the last few decades, of course, it's fallen short of what we wanted to do for all the reasons we've already discussed. But I mean, it has helped in the global fight against poverty, extreme poverty. That doesn't mean that poverty doesn't persist and exist, but it has done that. It has articulated international law. That happened as a result of multilateralism. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any international law. Everyone agreed to live by certain laws and rules. So international law would be non-existent if it wasn't for multilateralism being able to deliver. I think multilateralism will also help to expand social and economic progress across the world. It's not enough, but it's still managed to do that. I think it's also helped to uphold human rights. Again, hasn't done it in a perfect way. It's done it in a selective way. Often we are the biggest, we complain the most about that. And yet, let's face it, we do have two reports on occupied Jammu and Kashmir and the human rights violations there by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So, there is a great value to multilateralism, and I can go on with a list of what it has managed to do. But naturally, it's not enough. But it's necessary but not sufficient. It's created a base for us to cooperate, to create new ways of achieving international solidarity. Climate change now, of course, our government is very big on this, rightly so. That poses a big challenge. And, you did have an agreement, except that, one of the biggest countries and one of the biggest countries responsible for the highest emissions decided to pull out of it. But that hasn't taken away from the agreement that was reached for the rest of the world. I think what we're also seeing, I think this kind of in a way answers something that Ambassador Azaz raised in the beginning. We're also seeing a form of a la carte multilateralism practiced by big powers. So in other words, they take what they like. I mean, you have a menu of multilateralism. You kind of, select what works for you, especially in a situation where you say America first. So you pick what works for you, and what doesn't work for you, you abandon, you neglect, or you pull out. That still weakens multilateralism, because this kind of selectivity, especially in arrangements which you've previously signed up to, this sets sets back the whole process. But we are witnessing that trend, and it's an unfortunate trend.
If I can just add one point before I give the floor to Mateen Haider, who wants to ask the question. I do agree with you that geoeconomics is now leading the way because geopolitics somehow has been trumped by unilateralism. In our own neighborhood, where we see that three sub-regions of Asia are discovering huge opportunities of economic connectivity. We also see our eastern neighbor pursuing policies which are not conducive to that. So there is a tussle between the two, and I think Pakistan must stand on the right side of history, and I think geoeconomics is the way to go. That's my personal assessment. Mateen?
Thank you. It was definitely a wonderful lecture by Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi. Ambassador, my question is, we have seen all the developments since 5th of August, and we have seen United Nations' role in resolution of various conflicts where its role have been quite decisive in a number of issues around the world. But on Kashmir, despite worse human rights violation and so many things, which have been, of course, in front of the UN high authorities, we have seen United Nations have been why only confined to just condemnation and expressing concern, why there have been no decisive action despite one of the worst violations and atrocities committed by Indian forces since 5th of August. And second part, we were over there, and a day before Prime Minister's speech at UNGA, a highly classified letter on Hafiz Saeed was leaked to the media. So which Indian media played well against Pakistan. According to your opinion, who could be behind the leakage of highly classified letter which damaged Pakistan and benefited India? Thank you, Ambassador.
Is there anything? Yeah, somewhere here in the middle? Yes.
First of all, I would like to
One, which is, do bilateral agreements or more regional agreements, do they undermine the work of the UN? No, not at all, because they're not contrary to the work of the UN. There could be economic goals that regional organizations pursue, which are completely in sync with that. So, I mean, multilateralism does not exclude ever your ability to forge bilateral relations or to have bilateral agreements. Not at all. Multilateralism simply means that you're able to forge international agreements or rules that everyone signs up to, or at least the majority signs up to, and then you live by that. So, you know, they're not mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination. All countries exercise both, you know, bilateral paths and regional organizations, and we are part of many regional organizations as well. That doesn't, you know, in any way act as contrary to our membership of the United Nations. In fact, the United Nations has a series of debates in the Security Council where it encourages countries to cooperate regionally and then to interact with the UN as a consequence. You know, there are common issues or common goals that they're pursuing. Then the two can, you know, work in a mutually symbiotic manner, mutually reinforcing manner. So there is nothing of... Yes, the UN Charter also allows that, exactly. Coming to Kashmir, you know, you're absolutely right. Obviously, you know, our disappointment is, you know, 70 years old. And it has assumed a more acute nature in view of what has happened in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. But remember, the UN is an intergovernmental organization. It's not a supra-government organization. It cannot act beyond what member states permit it to or allow it to. Of course, there are variations in the role that Secretary Generals have played in the past. Some Secretary Generals have been more bold. They've spoken out much more. Others have been, let's say, more cautious. So there has been differences of that kind in personality of the Secretary General. But the you know, the ability to act on Kashmir obviously rests with the Security Council, because it is the Security Council which has these resolutions which have remained unimplemented. And there you know why that has happened over the years. It's happened over the decades because of geopolitics. It's happened because of the interests of countries on the Security Council. Some of the permanent members have acted in a way which has prevented the implementation of those resolutions. So that's nothing new. The challenge for Pakistan is to keep mobilizing international opinion. And I have to say, often we only look at what governments, the positions that governments take. Look at what has happened to international public opinion since India's August 5 action. International public opinion has been firmly on the side of the plight of the Kashmiri people, criticized, castigated. Even yesterday, Ambassador Azaz was mentioning an article in the New Yorker, for example. But this is just the most recent publication. But if you look at the international media, what it has been saying about what has happened in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, if you look at what human rights organizations have been saying and continue to say about the situation there, international public opinion is not just the opinion of governments. It is the opinion of civil society, of the media, organizations. And that opinion has been very clear that the lockdown, the curfew, and the restrictions which have been placed there must end, and that the people of the occupied land must be given the right to exercise freely how they want to govern themselves. So I think this is something that we should also always bear in mind, and because it has an influence on governments. Obviously, public opinion in our country has an influence on our government, so public opinion in other countries also has an influence. The challenge for us, of course, is to continue to mobilize support, to keep reinforcing this kind of international opinion, and to mobilize support. Now, on the question of mediation, I think that was your question. Mediation, the Secretary General has publicly and privately many times to us, including to our Prime Minister when he met him, has said, I'm ready to play a role. But I cannot play a role unless the other country also agrees, unless India also agrees. Mediation is between two countries. So both have to be willing. Therefore, there are limits, therefore, to what the Secretary General can do. Now, it leaves us extremely disappointed. But I think rather than being disappointed, we should see how best we can carry forward the kind of mobilization that has already taken place diplomatically. We did get a Security Council meeting, as I said, the first after 53 years, which discussed this. We did get the Human Rights Council, a strong statement at the Human Rights Council. We did get 2 reports on human rights abuse in occupied Kashmir by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. These are important, and we've got a series of statements, yes. Statements do shape opinion. So I wouldn't dismiss them as mere rhetoric. If the statements are coming of condemnation, of criticism, if they're coming from important people or important heads of state of other countries, these are extremely important because they're shaping opinion. And they're keeping attention, global attention on this issue. Because at a time when there are so many other global crises, the danger always is that attention may shift because it's been going on for such a long time. So I think, for Pakistan, the challenge will continue to remain. It's a clear and present challenge. We have to continue to see how best we can help the people of Jammu and Kashmir through every diplomatic and political means. It involves a great deal of, I think, thought and a strategy, political and diplomatic. And I think ISS has a role to play in that. Ambassador Azaz was telling me about ideas that have been discussed in your... ideas are not the preserve of the government. Often governments are devoid of new ideas because they're so hung up on old ideas. So I think, people like yourselves, people at the Institute, people from outside the government can help the government in, initiating new ideas about how best to take the diplomatic campaign on Kashmir forward. But I do think that, as I said, international opinion remains. It's very important. It's a very important positive that we must not dismiss or write off because it doesn't happen to reflect a government's position. it will begin to affect government, many government's positions if it is sustained. I think I've pretty much answered. Mateen Haider, I can talk to you later about issues that you are particularly interested in, which are not exactly multilateral, but we can certainly talk about that. I think I've covered.
I think there was one point the
Sorry.
gentleman raised,
Oh,
whether the
okay.
Shimla Agreement is impeding
No.
the role of the UN and third-party mediation.
No, not at all. Because we never, my understanding is that these arrangements never precluded Pakistan. Pakistan was not about to sign up to anything which prevented it from taking up the issue internationally. And it never stopped us. We never stopped. I mean, either one should point, I mean, Indians use this. The Indians use this as an argument that actually you had precluded your right. But that's their argument, not ours. We never ruled out going out and raising the issue internationally. Plus, if you look at the situation, I mean, Simla Agreement, put that aside for a minute. If the bilateral track is frozen, India refuses to speak, to have a dialogue, to discuss the issue. What is Pakistan supposed to do? Obviously, go to every international organization that it can, raise the issue internationally. That is Pakistan's sovereign right, and we will continue to do that, and we have done that. And it has imposed a cost. Let's not forget, there are diplomatic costs that have been imposed on India by its action and Pakistan's diplomatic campaign.
Thank you.
Ambassador Lodhi, I didn't wish.
Pakistan also has announced its candidacy for a few years later. You know, we contest once every 10 years, so you can imagine we came off the council in 2014. So we're up for election in a few years' time. We will begin campaigning. We've already started, in fact, we started a year ago, lining up support on reciprocal basis, which is how elections are fought. You support my candidacy and I support yours for whatever it is, whether it's the Council or the Human Rights Council. So that process is underway. India will go first, obviously. They announced their candidature earlier. But I will mention one thing. I mean, I'm not commenting on India's candidature for the non-permanent seat, but I have to mention the fact that, increasingly we are also seeing, I mean, this is also one of the dynamics at work. I didn't get a chance to mention this earlier, but Sarwar's question triggered this in my mind. We are seeing powerful countries losing elections. First time. So we saw, I mean, I don't want to name them because it would not be correct, but, one very powerful country, one of the P5, let's say, lost the election to the Human Rights Council just a few years ago. I was there. I mean, we were all quite stunned. Another country that Azaz was talking a great deal about has lost repeatedly elections in the last 2 years to various UN bodies. And then we also had strong regional countries losing elections. So, somebody talked about multipolarity. This is really multipolarity in some respects at work, because you're looking at very powerful nations who, I mean, some countries never campaigned for anything because they didn't need to. They all would automatically get elected. Now they're campaigning. They have to come to us and say, we'd like your vote. So, we always say to them, if you can stop criticizing us in public, we'll give you our vote, but not otherwise. So, you are looking at very changed dynamics at the UN, and at times you have to, in a way, step back and say to yourself, okay, how do I analyze this, and how do I report this to my capital? Because I don't want to capture sort of transient trends in a manner that misleads the capital. But at the same time, if I don't describe some of this, the capital won't really know, what's at work at the UN. So, the prospect of resolution, finally, Kashmir, I think, yes, the UN has a role to play, and we have to continue hammering this. We cannot step back from this. The UN has a role because there is a legal position that Pakistan has, which is predicated and based on UN Security Council resolutions, which were adopted, which are there, which are on the books. And at times, when I went to lobby for this Security Council meeting, which took place on August the 16th, obviously India was lobbying too. So we were lobbying, obviously, for different things. They didn't want this meeting to take place. We wanted very much the meeting to take place. And many times, some ambassadors of member states used to turn around and say, why do you keep talking about these Security Council resolutions? They're so old. And I used to say, I can't believe you're saying this, because does that mean law has an expiry date? Because Security Council resolutions constitute part of international law. So are we saying that just because something has not been implemented, it dies? Then we will throw every rule, every law, and sort of live in the law of the jungle if we were to concede to that principle. So I think it was an important event to take place to even inform member states about the nature of the resolutions and why these were never implemented and why it's important to implement them in the promises that were made to the people. So I think, again, I come back to this, the challenge is enormous. But this is a challenge we must live up to, because Kashmir is fundamental to our foreign policy. It is fundamental to us, to our country. This is not an issue that we can, sort of throw up our hands in despair and say there's nothing more we can do. There is plenty more we can do. And I think we should continue to sustain the diplomatic momentum that we were able to establish. And yes, there is always the danger that you pointed to, that domestic issues obviously tend to get much more what is earlier described as greater screen time, airtime. But that's a challenge that we also have to. I mean, that's the job of the government. You cannot let the urgent take precedence over the important or the fundamental. So sometimes the urgent does intercede, but the important and the fundamental is Kashmir, and that must never, that must never fall off the agenda in any respect. And the diplomatic momentum, as I said, must be sustained, and that must not wane in any respect. And I have no doubt that the government it's fully committed to ensuring that momentum is sustained.
Well, thank you so much. I think you've been wonderful audience. While it's a great audience,
and multilateralism at large is my pet subject also, because I devoted about 17 years of my service to multilateralism. But my experience is stale. We have heard from Dr. Maleeha Lodhi, who is fresh from New York, the state of affairs of multilateralism and the UN. women, children, aged, all these things. And that is particularly the domain of the human rights. I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, that is a Magna Carta of human rights. Every more or less constitution in the world, of every country, it derives the inspiration from this declaration, and then we have conventions on the rights of women, rights of children, against torture, against racial discrimination, and so on. So much that we have now Human Rights Council, which has introduced a universal periodic review, a system under which the human rights record of each and every country is scrutinized. Previously, it used to be only the record of that country will be scrutinized against whom there is a complaint. But now, periodically, the human rights record of every country comes under examination in this council. So the system, of course, imperfect, has survived over 70 years, as against the League of Nations, which could survive only for 25 years. So there is something there that this system is still continuing. Of course, there are new challenges, it was pointed out: globalization, climate change, terrorism, and empowerment of women, and all these things. And I think UN is trying to cope with these challenges as best as it can, because the UN provides a forum for discussing all these issues and then synthesizing the very different interests, competing priorities. All this is possible only because there is a forum where you can meet and discuss and harmonize your policies and then try to adhere to those commitments which you make there. So it is a great purveyor of ideas, and discussion, norm setting, standard setting. All these things is thanks to the UN. Of course, the system needs reforms because you can't have a Remington typewriter in this, smartphone world. You have to keep on adjusting the working of the system structure of the UN, and there is effort afoot at the UN. Of course, not just focusing on the reform of the Security Council, to bring about greater coordination among all this UN broad area of activities. And all this is happening at a very low cost. You see, I was reading somewhere that the budget of the UN is less, half of the budget of the New York City. And somebody said it is equal to the sewerage system of the New York City. So it is such activity by the UN spread all over the world and at such a low cost. And one should not forget how much is spent on armament, and this is just a very small fraction. So I think one should, I would recall what Dag Hammarskjöld said about the UN, because there are a lot of expectations from the UN. He said UN was established not to take you to heaven, but to save you from hell. So this is the, right perspective. And so upshot is that we need not less but more of the UN, but of improved UN, and also a UN which can work in a coherent manner and address not only the economic and social, cultural, field, but also contributes better in the maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you.